Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a look at what's in tomorrow's newspapers as they arrive. Joining us to offer their insights into their headlines, the Times columnist Matthew Syed and the writer and columnist Christina Paterson. First, let's take a look at what's on those front pages. Theresa May writes in the Sunday Telegraph that she has silenced her Brexit critics by securing the first stage of the deal. In the Sunday Times, the Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson calls on the Prime Minister to strike an exit deal that gives Britain the power to ditch EU laws. The Observer also leads with Brexit, saying Conservative peers are telling Theresa May not to bully members into backing an extreme form of Brexit. The Sunday Express also has the Prime Minister saying she'll press on with Brexit despite a Commons rebellion. The Mail on Sunday reports a left-wing group sent online abuse to Conservative MP's pregnant wife. The Daily Star on Sunday says two off Strictly Come Dancing stars are having a secret fling which has been exposed online. So welcome once again to Matthew and Christina. Good to see you. Let's talk about this story which is on the front page of The Observer. The headline, call off Brexit billies or face defeat. Tory peer tells Theresa May.
Well, this is an interesting development. Various Tory peers, in particular Patience Wheatcroft, who I think I wrongly said in the first half used to edit the FT, she used to edit the Sunday Telegraph, and Ros Altman, the former pensions minister, have written a letter basically telling Theresa May that she needs to calm things down. The so-called Brexit bullies, these people who, well, they're not so-called actually, they are bullies. This week when when Parliament lost, when Theresa May lost the vote, the 11 rebels were treated as if they were criminals, and they have had death threats, and the Brexiteers have been really appalling to them.
Which is wrong, but were they not just derailing the process? I mean, Theresa May has a duty to push Brexit through.
No, they weren't. It was not about, it was nothing to do with trying to thwart Brexit. It was to do with sovereignty, which is what Brexit was meant to be about. It was saying Parliament, the British Parliament has to be sovereign here. And you can't just delegate this to one person, whether that's David Davies, Theresa May, or even the EU. That was the principle. And along with that, in fact, there's a whole other complicated thing about Henry VIII powers, which meant that essentially this was overruling. This was putting legislation, kind of rolling it into a new lot of legislation without Parliament having the right to vote on it. It was absolutely that principle which I completely support, and that's not to do with thwarting Brexit. And these peers are saying, look, you've got to calm these people down, because otherwise you're going to get a lot of trouble in the House of Lords.
Yeah, because Matthew, the allegation is that they're weakening the Prime Minister's hand.
Well, I mean, what this story is really showing us, that the Prime Minister has done very well in showing great tenacity to get to this point through stage one of the negotiations, but the real battle starts here. And it's only partly about the negotiation with the European Union to get the best possible deal for the country. The even bigger battle is going to be within the Conservative Party about what the ultimate vision for Brexit should look like. There is a fundamental schism within the Cabinet. Yeah. With two different alternatives. The hardliners like Boris Johnson and Michael Gove have one vision, Philip Hammond, possibly Theresa May herself, have a different vision.
We don't even know what vision she has.
They're going to debate it next week for the first time. Just one thing on sovereignty, however. One thing on sovereignty. I agree with you that the bullying is wrong, and that these 11 who rebelled were being attacked by Brexiteers who have rebelled dozens of times in their parliamentary careers, and these deselections that are being mooted, I think, are quite wrong. But if the members of Parliament in the House of Commons, the majority of whom are Remainers, decided that they were going to use the sovereignty to reject Brexit altogether, No matter what deal comes back, they say, no, we don't like it. And we're not prepared to go out on WTO rules either. They could constantly say that. Most of them want to stay... Most members of Parliament prefer remaining to any possible vision of Brexit.
But Matthew,
if they did decide to exercise the sovereignty that Christina has just described, to reject... I'm not saying that that's what they're intending to do, but there are one or two who you know, like Kenneth Clarke, would vote for Remain.
Don't want it to happen.
He just doesn't want it to happen. And I mean, Christina's probably in that boat too.
Yeah, but
I mean, when people voted for sovereignty of Parliament, what they meant is taking back powers from the European Union. If Parliament said we want them to retain the power and therefore were to limit their own sovereignty, that isn't what people want.
Why it bothers people and the concerns that they've expressed. I mean, this is the front page of the Telegraph. It says Theresa May's proved her doubters wrong. I mean, she's had a really tough 6 months or a year, and you know, every time after every stumble she's bounced back, so you know, credit to her for that.
Absolutely. And she's got unbelievable stamina. How she gets up in the morning, I have no idea. And I think she did manage to turn this one around in spite of the DUP's best efforts to thwart it. But as Matthew says, this is just the beginning, and I can't see the DUP, the Irish, the hard right Brexiteers being happy with the net result, because where we go from here, there are all kinds of irreconcilables floating around, not least if we do go, it looks as though the consensus within the Cabinet at the moment is for so-called Canada Plus Plus, which is a Canada trade treaty which took 7 years to negotiate, which is not customs union or single market. They want a bespoke deal with services included, which is frankly unlikely. That's not going to happen without there being a hard border in Ireland. So I don't see how...
Yeah, I mean, on the issue of the hard border, I mean, the second phase is going to be talk about our future relationship and the issue of trade. So when will the issue of Ireland and the hard border pop up?
I think they will, and they will eventually have to confront it. But this thing here about May proving the doubters wrong, just briefly, I heard a report, I can't remember where this week, that there was a focus group who are asked to try and think of what image they have when they think of Theresa May, and it was a Robin Reliant. You know, well, I think the one that Del Boy had, right? Just keeps going. You know, it looks as if it's going to sort of stop at some point, and it just keeps on going. It has to be said, however, part of her strength is because there are no alternative prime ministers in the cabinet who I think that the party would unite around, for sure, frankly. And also, the Conservative backbenchers and the DUP are absolutely paranoid about the government falling and Jeremy Corbyn coming in, who would be, for a lot of them, an absolute catastrophe.
Hence why some of the arch-Brexiteers have been quite muted over the last couple of days. The Foreign Secretary has been using quite a colourful language, which he is known for, saying that Brexit mustn't leave us a vassal state of the European Union.
Well, he has been so unclear about what he wants. And frankly, this isn't the Boris show. You know, it's meant to be the Great Britain show, which is, you know, something rather different. But he's now claiming that his anxiety is that if we go down the route that, you know, might look as though it's tending towards soft Brexit, we have at the moment actually no idea what it's tending towards. We simply, the only thing that has been discussed is a transitional arrangement, which probably will be something that looks like, well, which will be very much like the current relationship, because there isn't room for manoeuvre for it to be anything much else. He's saying that if we essentially go for the soft Brexit route, which means that we have a fair amount of access to the single market and customs union, and we don't have, say we went for an EFTA deal, the Norway deal, then we wouldn't have gained very much. Well, that's absolutely right, we wouldn't have. But if we go for the hard Brexit route, then we lose all the preferential trading terms. So, I mean, either way, we're looking at really damage limitation, because if we did go for Canada Plus Plus, we're not likely to get the plus plus. If we went for Canada, we'd lose the EU side of things in terms of in the preferential form we have at the moment.
And it's time as well. Like, you know, how long is all of this going to take?
Well, quite. But just picking up on your point about the language, it is very emotive, isn't it? A vassal state. Jacob Rees-Mogg in an interview this week described the transitional arrangements as potentially putting Britain in as an EU colony. And they really are trading on this idea of
the
sovereignty.
EU being a super state.
Yes. I mean, there are unquestionably people in the EU who want ever closer union and the potential European state. I mean, I think that is an aspiration for some of the sort of hardliners on that side of the argument.
That notion of a vassal state is almost, it's worse than the United Kingdom staying in the European Union, because it's that we're subjects.
I mean, actually, the transitional deal is unquestionably worse, as it would be if we had a Norway model. We'd have to accept the rules of the European Union, we'd have to pay into the European Union, but we'd have no say on what the rules were. We wouldn't have the qualified majority voting, we wouldn't have the veto.
In terms of sovereignty, it's definitely worse.
Much worse.
But it might still be better economically.
Well, that's exactly what he's saying it wouldn't be, because what Johnson, Gove and others genuinely, I think sincerely believe, well, certainly John Redwood sincerely believes that if you're outside the customs union and you can negotiate free trade deal, I mean, they see the EU as a bit of a protectionist racket. There's an external I mean, it's fair to say, I was a Remainer, but the external tariff means that British consumers, particularly poor British consumers, pay more money for the products that they consume, particularly food, footwear and clothing, and that redistributes money from British consumers to European producers at the expense of third world producers who are impoverished. Look, I'm not saying that, I mean, this is obviously a holistic argument, but I think it is fair to say that there are Brexiteers who genuinely think we will be richer as a consequence.
Well, they do, but there aren't very many economists who think that, and they tend not to be people who know all that much about the economy. And actually, given the drop in the pound, British consumers are already paying a lot more for their goods than they were before the referendum. And the vast majority of opinion is that the trading possibilities outside the EU are not going to make up for the loss, because the further you go away, if you're talking about India or whatever, the further you go away, the smaller the benefit.
But we will have our sovereignty back. Let's move on to this next story. A royal wedding coming up in the summer.
I don't know about that. Can you tell me about that?
Come on, really?
Apparently the hotels are already selling out.
This is marvellous. This is absolutely marvellous. When I was a student, I really sort of struggled with the idea of the monarchy. It just seemed to be the hereditary principle seemed to me to be utterly ridiculous.
Well, it is ridiculous.
It is ridiculous. But the older I've got, I've sort of fallen into line with my father, who came to the UK from Pakistan. I think, like a lot of first-generation immigrants, they've really embraced these British institutions, monarchy and Radio 4 and Test match cricket and cream tea. And I have to say, I'm really looking forward to this. And I think Harry has been fantastic. When you think how difficult it is to be a member of the royal family under the scrutiny of us in the media, living a life in a goldfish bowl, and he's such a natural, decent, humane, principled person. I hope this marriage goes wonderfully well.
I couldn't agree more, and she seems like a sweetie as well. But I have to say, I love the Queen and I love Harry. I'm afraid Charles a little bit less. So I don't think when the Queen goes, I don't think there's going to be quite the fascination.
Will you become a Republican at that point?
I used to be a Republican, actually.
Well, fortunately for all of us, you haven't got a say on the issue, Christina. So I was going to pause.
I'm going to be running the world, Carl. I don't know what you're talking about.
I'm going to pause momentarily for a break. Do stay with us. Coming up, should online shopping be banned on Christmas Day? This is a story which is in the Mail by one of our reviewers, Dan Hodges. What's he writing about?
This is quite an interesting column, isn't it? Where he, I think rightly, is pointing out the hypocrisy in Labour's stance on Brexit. In that Jeremy Corbyn, as we all basically know, is a Brexiteer. He doesn't like the European Union, thinks it's a bit of a bankers and financiers racket. There's some interesting interviews on YouTube, from 10, 15 years ago, where his true colours on the European Union really come out. But of course, Labour Party was in favour of Remain, and he campaigned slightly half-heartedly, it has to be said.
Slightly half-heartedly, he didn't campaign at all.
Let's put it there, quarter-heartedly. Tenth-heartedly, where should we go down to?
Millionth-heartedly.
But, you know, the amazing thing is, they know that if they commit to a soft Brexit, or, you know, if they lose their Remainer credentials, there are a lot of core Labour voters who are hardcore Brexiteers, and vice versa. So they've played this game, not really telling us what they think. And when they do, you have different people in the shadow cabinet saying completely different. And Corbyn, who knows where?
Keep calm, keep quiet, and carry on.
Yeah, and amazing cynicism. And they've got away with it, haven't they?
Well, the absolute bombshell in this piece, actually, is that there was apparently a briefing that to The Guardian last week, in which Labour actually said Corbyn's team believe Labour's general election strategy of appealing to both Leavers and Remainers worked well, and that spelling out a more specific position now would risk alienating key groups, i.e. they don't believe anything at all about Brexit. They do not have a view on Brexit. They are simply going to do whatever. They're not going to spell out a position, A, because they don't have one, apart from Corbyn, who is very clearly a Brexiteer, and they are going to milk this ambiguity in order to get as many votes as possible, which is just, I think, despicably cynical. It really is. And I think I would expect no...
Is that fair, Matthew? Because, you know, it is on the claim that, you know, they want to have all the benefits of being in the single market and the customs union, but not being in the single markets and customs union.
I think in political terms, it's pragmatic. I mean, it's desperately cynical. Desperately cynical.
Really cynical.
But, you know, I don't think it will last that long. At some point, Keir Starmer is going to have to drop the sort of nuanced language that is somehow keeping this very broad, tender opinion together, and they're going to have to say what they really think. For the time... Look, I think that their genuine hope is that at some point the government will fall and they'll have an opportunity to find a general election. If not, they'll have to wait until after Brexit.
And then what are they going to do? I mean, what on earth position are they going to take on Brexit? I mean, heaven only knows, because they have given no indication apart from a jobs-friendly Brexit, whatever that might be.
Let's move on to this story, which is in the Mail. It's a horrendous story, one of a young lad that got accused of rape. Police had information, details that would have thrown this case out of court a long time ago, and they didn't reveal that. So
there's an important legal principle that the police should offer evidence that can help the defence as part of the attempt by the Defence Counsel to exonerate somebody who, of course, in our criminal justice system is presumed innocent. This didn't happen in this case. Text messages that had been sent by the alleged victim to the accused were held by the police but not disclosed to the defence. And had it been disclosed, I don't think it could have possibly come to trial, because it exonerated him, according to this story and other stories, in a pretty dramatic way. There is a police officer who is identified in this story on the spread who didn't provide the information. I think it's very interesting that Liam Allen, the accused, is saying we shouldn't just blame that police officer. This could well be, as it often is, systemic, that there may well be deeper lying problems in the system, a cavalier attitude from the police and the Crown Prosecution Service towards people who are accused, and a number of other things of that kind. I think it's really important that lessons are learned, because otherwise it undermines real rape victims if there are spurious allegations that are being pursued by the courts that eventually fall.
Just got about 45 seconds, Christina. He was let down by the system, failed.
But I think this is a really tragic... Well, I mean, you know, thank God it wasn't tragic in that he has now not, you know, he's not... The case has fallen. But he sounds like an incredibly lovely and compassionate young man who has been through nothing less than hell for 2 years, who is amazingly unvengeful about what he's been through. But he was really betrayed by the system. And I have to say, I do sometimes think we should look again at the system that means that you name people who are accused, and the accuser has lifelong protection of anonymity, and I think that's not fair.
OK, just 20 seconds ago, this final story on the Mail. The Bishop wants to ban online shopping on Christmas Day.
Absolutely...
Surely not.
It's ridiculous. The Bishop of Chelmsford has said that we should ban people from going on the internet and buying stuff in the Christmas sales on Christmas Day, because we should spend more time with the family and go to church. As if you can regulate what people do.
Internet.
He says, yes, we need to have a clamp down on this. The Bishop of Chelmsford.
Matthew, Christina, good to see you. Thanks for joining us.
And now to the papers. The front pages, as ever. We've got somebody who thinks that Rees-Mogg is a sex god on the front page of the Sunday Times, apparently, and a big interview with Tim Shipman has done with Boris Johnson, where he says we mustn't be left as a vassal state or a colony of the EU, as Rees-Mogg puts it. The Sunday Telegraph has a story from Theresa May again. She's written for them as well as for the Express. I've proved the doubters wrong, she said, and she's carrying on. And there, of course, is Joe. I'm sure we'll watch that. It's basically, strictly, has become a personality contest, I think, and everybody loved Joe. We'll talk more about that later on. There's another personality contest in South Africa going on the front page of The Observer, a new leader for the ANC very shortly, and they have a very different take on Brexit. Call off the Brexit bullies or face defeat, Tory peers tell May. They've written a piece in the paper about the dangers of Theresa May leaning too far, as it were, to Boris Johnson and the Corbyn and that lot. There's a story about Corbyn trolling a Tory MP on the front page of the Mail on Sunday, but I have to say this story is rather lacking in names and details, and we probably won't give it a lot of attention. Then there's finally the Sunday Express. Theresa May has written there as well, I won't be derailed, she says. So we'll hear more about that. Tim, you're interviewing Boris Johnson. We'd love to see him here in due course, but you've been interviewing him in the Sunday Times. What's the top line? Well,
he's very puckish. He's going to Russia next week, but he couldn't resist talking about Brexit. And as soon as I asked him about it, Boris waxed lyrical about how these meetings are happening early next week of the Cabinet. Everyone's going to put out their points of view, and Boris is saying it's very important that when we leave, we're able to ditch EU rules. We don't want to be a vassal state, and we've got to be able to do our own thing.
Now, this is more or less what Theresa May said in the Florence speech, but there is now a clear gap. We're not allowed to use words like hard or soft or all the rest of it, but there is a clear gap between those people who want us to stay as close as possible to the EU, the kind of convergers or the continental shelf party, and those who want to turn their back on that and look out to the rest of the world, the deep blue sea party. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. You've got Boris and Michael Gove and Gavin Williamson on one side. You've got Philip Hammond, Amber Rudd and others on the other. And there's going to be, you know, a fairly big ding-dong over the next month or so in the Cabinet around that. Also in the paper this morning revealing that people like Gove want to ditch the Working Time Directive. That will become quite a sort of heated debate, I suspect. But they're looking for ways that we can use the freedoms that we will have to try and make something, you know, what they would call...
Very different kind of economy, a different kind of society.
Well, potentially, yes.
Absolutely. Theresa May herself, as I said, was writing in a couple of papers. She'd been busy with her pen, her Mont Blanc pen, overnight. Rachel, just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes, I mean, I think I haven't... This is a piece that at the FT we used to call a Migo piece, which is my eyes glaze over, because it took me so many attempts, actually, to get through to the third leg of it. And essentially she's saying, you know, it's steady as she goes, I'm getting on with the job, you know, as a woman does, and all the rest of it. But it's when you get towards the end that you see that Theresa May realises that her government has a problem, which is it's being consumed by Brexit. And so at some point in the piece she says, and we're also doing this for people, young people, and housing, all the rest of it. So she is trying, in the margins, it has to be said, to address the causes of Brexit as well as Brexit. So, you know, she really has got a job on her hands.
And I used the word resilient. She's like one of those kind of fairground things where every time you knock her, she comes straight back up again.
Of course.
There is a kind of, perhaps, a growing sense that she is able at least to keep going when lots of people, lots of men would have given up at that point and stormed off in a huff, resigned.
To me, it's a bit like the charge of the Light Brigade. You know, she's got cannons to the left of them, cannons to the right of them, and then she's got the EU in front, cannons in front of her, and as far as I'm aware, into the Valley of Death, which is going out of the EU over the cliff.
Well, some people in the country agree with you because there's a new poll today from The Independent.
Yes, we do. We have the largest gap between people who actually now want to remain in the EU and those who want to leave. We have 51% backing remaining in the Union and 41% still want to leave. And it sort of feeds into this greater sense of course, a rebellion, as we saw it with the Conservatives who went against the government this week, that perhaps we're in that situation.
Of course, we've had polls going in lots of different directions. Another poll in the Sun, this is only one poll, but there may be some sense the mood of the country is changing from the kind of anti-Brexit side of the argument, as it were, though they accept that it's going to happen now. The Observer has majored on, as I said earlier on, the Tory Remainers, flexing their muscles, determined to carry on fighting in the House of Lords if necessary.
Yes, so there's two elements to what the Observer have done today. in the week where the Conservative rebels, branded mutineers or traitors, whatever you want to call them, flexed their parliamentary muscle, as it were. What now for the hard line, for the Brexiteers? And actually, some quotes here saying, now the hard Brexiteers are no longer important. Not only did they push to get the EU referendum, but actually their voices are being drowned out within parliamentary process. And obviously you've quoted already Jacob Rees-Mogg saying we don't want to become an EU colony. Boris represents Boris Johnson, this other side of this, where he talks very much about we must have total divergence from the law, but they are now being outnumbered and defeated. And two Conservative peers have written in The Observer this morning saying we will not, Patience Wheatcroft and Ros Altman, the former pensions minister, we will not be bullied in the House of Lords. And it's interesting, in a week where Lord Winston on Question Time was talking about actually maybe Brexit will not happen. It's an interesting tone that is starting to happen as it gets into the hands of Parliament.
You see, I think if you'd been looking from outside, you'd think that the people pro-Brexit were absolutely in the driving seat, and you'd find this very, very hard to believe that they have suddenly lost all that power, lost all that gumption, that purchase in the last few days. Tim, what do you think?
Well, I think it's pretty difficult to see it being overturned. The problem Theresa May has got is that there looks like there's probably a majority in the House of Commons for what you might have once called a softer Brexit. Yes. But within the Conservative Party, there's still a strong majority in favour of a clean break and doing it in the way that Boris would like.
But the big problem is we never seem to know what Theresa May actually thinks. She herself fudges it.
Here is the question, because there is going to be a cabinet meeting this week in which we are told everybody is going to lay out their own vision of what's going to be Britain's relationship with the EU and the rest of the world after Brexit. And presumably that must mean the Prime Minister finally says, well, actually, do you know what? This is what I want.
Well, I wouldn't put too much of your salary on that. I mean, Downing Street are even briefing already that the Prime Minister will sit and listen to the views of her ministers, but will not provide, a strong lead herself. She will go away over Christmas and work out where she can come back in the new year and make a speech that tries to synthesise all these views. It's going to be very difficult for her.
Let's go to somebody who we certainly know what he thinks. Dominic Grieve is in the Mail. He's had a very, very torrid week. Seems to be bloodied but unbowed, I think it's fair to say.
Well, the story they've got here is of a confrontation between Dominic Grieve, the sort of rebel commander, and Julian Smith, who is the new chief whip, who's having a fairly torrid time. He might well look back on his old mate Gavin Williamson, who escaped the whip's office to go and be Defence Secretary, and look at him thinking, he got out at the right time.
He needs his tarantula.
Well, I mean, what this highlights is the sort of tensions in the Tory party, accusations of betrayal, and there's still a great sensitivity with May and her team at the centre, who are worried about any form of dissent from these people like Grieve.
Let's bravely and boldly break away from Brexit and go to another story, the automatic pension story, Rachel, which is all over the news today and kind of takes us all back to our early years, because this is a story whereby I think 900,000 more young people are going to be automatically enrolled in pension schemes.
I know, I haven't drilled down particularly, but I mean, one always asks in these questions, and Emma's very good at asking it, but how much is it going to cost the government and all the rest of it, or the employers, if they're going to have to match contributions?
Or the employees, because the amount that you pay in goes up quite sharply next year.
We were all saying to each other that, in our 20s, pensions were, we were never going to get old, were we, Andrew?
And look what happened.
look at us
I
now.
don't think we've got the best pension plans
when
either.
I started out in journalism, I was at the FT, I was not allowed to join the pension scheme. So this is a welcome reverse ferret.
Yes, but the red tape to businesses will be interesting, because at the same time the Conservatives are trying to appeal to young people. And perhaps it's not the sexiest sell, it's pensions, but it is obviously important. And if you're joining the workforce at 18, you're not going to university, you're not paying tuition fees.
And you won't be able to buy a house, which is the pension asset of us older generation.
Absolutely. Emma, let me turn to another story, which is the Grenfell Tower.
Yes.
One of the dominating stories of this year. Now, Steve McQueen is an artist and a filmmaker, a real rising star in that world, and he's making a film about it, is that right?
Yes, and he grew up in a council estate not far from Grenfell, so he starts work tomorrow to create a project, a lasting memorial. He's going to use a helicopter to film, of course, the carcass of that building still standing. The eyes of the country and possibly the world this week were forced back again onto what has happened to the survivors of Grenfell, remembering the 71 who died at that national memorial at St Paul's. And I think he's obviously a very fitting choice to try and do justice if that's the right way of saying it, to creating a memorial to those people who lost their lives. The helicopter, as I say, will film the child remains of the building, but it's going to go on display eventually in the London Museum.
Do you know what's going to happen? Sorry.
Yeah, I was about to say, I live about 200 yards from Grenfell Tower, and I think there's some suggestion from the people who actually lived in the tower that they want it to remain as it is, as a memorial,
yes,
as a reminder of what happened to those people who died.
Although, I mean, there is...
It is being clad at the moment, but I mean, I think it's still in the balance. I think it's good that he's recording it as it is.
It would be a fairly hideous thing to see every time you come into London, that great big blackened stump staring at you as you come along the Westway.
It's like a charcoal coffin.
But I do think, to Rachel's point here, with Theresa May writing this piece today about, you know, Brexit, all it has been for a lot of people is a single issue government. And actually this week, by having 6 months on commemorated at St Paul's at a national place and seeing politicians, the royal family and people who were affected by that tragedy all sitting together, I can't remember a service like that other than military
services.
services.
Something very special, absolutely.
I think focuses the mind again on those people.
Absolutely. Let's turn to more politics, this time in South Africa, Tim Shipman. You've got a big spread there from your paper about the ANC's
by the
struggle
Sunday
for...
Times graphics department there, but
Yeah,
it's a reminder that, you know, chaotic politics is not confined to Britain. The ANC annual get-together has begun, and it's all about who replaces Jacob Zuma. It is a measure of the trouble that Zuma is in, facing 800 accusations of corruption, that he wants his ex-wife to take over because she might give him a pardon and protect him from prosecution. The favourite is Cyril Ramaphosa, who's his deputy. International business is waiting to see what happens. They're hoping Ramaphosa wins and goes in and cleans out the organ stables.
And it's a very, very spectacular sight, the ANC conference. It puts our party political conferences to shame with all the dancing and the music and the whooping. Yeah. Anyway, one final story I absolutely insist on discussing is Strictly. Big shot. Thank you very much.
What on earth was that? But I liked it.
I don't know what it was called, Emma, but let's...
That was
that your audition?
That was an Alex
That's all
leg
I can
movement.
do. That's my entire repertoire. Well, I watched a bit of it. It's a hit. It's wonderful, isn't it?
And they have 2 or 3 people who are absolutely spectacular dancers, but who didn't actually win, because in the end, when the public vote, it's about whether they like you or not.
Well,
it's quite
about,
tough, isn't it?
I mean, I think that it's not a... I think Joe McFadden was a brilliant winner, but is it necessarily about who the best person wins or who is most well known to the public?
Joe
who has the best social media game?
It was a great victory for Scotland, is what it was. Yeah, there's Joe.
I like that's how you're viewing it. But also, I think it's good to mention, you know, Debbie McGee, 59 years of age, someone older not being a joke on the programme.
And she was brilliant.
In the final.
And she was amazing.
Sensational. Well, listen,
and a great result, too, for Katja Jones, who triumphed. Anyone would think it was Ed Balls that was holding her back.
Ed Balls, his previous partner, triumphs. OK, well, listen, I'm going to ask you all to come back and talk about 2018 right at the end of the show. But for now, thank you very much.
Time now to take a look at the Sunday papers. And I'm delighted to be joined by Nina Schick, European political commentator, the Mirror columnist Susie Boniface, and the co-chair of Leave Means Leave and former head of the British Chamber of Commerce, John Longworth. Lovely to see you all. Very good morning. Hope you've done your Christmas shopping. Shall we start with the front page of the Sunday Times? And interesting, this actually, a very long interview on the Insight with Tim Shipman and Boris Johnson, but it's the idea that we could be left as a vassal state, a phrase that I don't think has ever been used as much as this week. Do explain.
Yes, well, Boris has made another famous intervention into the Brexit debate, and I think from reading the article, obviously I have the view from the EU as well, and I don't think it makes much logical sense, because this is fundamentally a question that the cabinet has to decide. Where does it want to end up in its future trading relationship with the EU? Does it want to remain closely aligned, or does it not want to? Does it want to diverge from the EU? And this is something that the cabinet itself has not decided. Of course, we had that deal last week, and we know that now we're moving on to future trade. But the reality is we are not. We will only be talking about future trade in March 2019, and essentially the cabinet has to decide first what it wants.
I mean, doesn't Boris to an extent have a point? There was talk earlier this week about a punishment clause being inserted in whatever agreement we have, that if we decide to diverge, then, you know, there could be problems for us ahead. I mean, This is a fundamental question, as Nina says, about the relationship that we want to have with the European Union, and I thought the whole point of leaving was to get as far away from them as possible.
Yeah, divergence is a huge issue with the Northern Irish border, and then if you don't have Northern Ireland leaving in the same way the rest of the UK does, then you're not upholding the democratic vote for everyone to leave. The issue you're going to have here with Boris is that he's doing what he's done before, is he's letting his mouth flap off at the gums, and we are currently in a position where the EU has said we need to have some clarity from the British government. Tell us where you expect to be in 5 years' time. You all have to agree. Now, the Tories haven't been able to agree on the issue of Europe for 40 years, and Theresa May's next task, and the reason why this is the ugliest part of the negotiation, is going to be forcing her own party, the headbangers, the wingnuts, the die-hard Remainers and Leavers, to try to have some kind of a compromise and agree where they all want to be. And until she gets that, we can't move any further on. Boris immediately saying, you know, I'm off over here on the left and I'm going to do things this way, that's not going to help her at all.
I mean, what does business want, John?
Well, Boris is right in the sense that he has to put forward the view that the party has to have a very clear position about the direction of travel, because unless we understand where the UK is going before March next year, we haven't got the time to walk and adopt WTO measures, which means that part of the leverage the UK has with the EU in the negotiations disappears. We have to be very clear what the end result is, and Philip Hammond, of course, quite wrongly and damagingly for the British economy, has been pushing forward the idea that we should salvage as much of the status quo as possible, which means we can only be worse off.
You know, exactly. So, leaving aside transition, I mean, what is the best state? What is the best relationship for us to be having with Europe from a business perspective? The ability to diverge, one would presume.
The very best outcome would be to have a Canada-style deal with some additional aspects related to services, if possible, not necessary, and at the same time to have as much freedom as possible for the UK to adjust its economy in the way it wants to. Trade deals elsewhere, removing external tariffs, cutting taxes and so on. That's the best outcome. The trade deal is only worth so much. If you give away too many of the freedoms and pay too much for it, actually it will damage the economy.
Let's go inside the Sunday Telegraph, shall we? And David Cameron, busy man these days, isn't he?
He's a very busy man. When he's not buying his third home in Cornwall and sitting in his £25,000 shepherd's hut.
I love that shed, I've got to say. If I had to spare 25k, I would be buying a shed like that.
My shed's falling down, and if I had 25k, I would not be spending it on another shed. But yes, he's been cleared by the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, ACOBA as it's known. Now, this is the body set up to ensure that there isn't a revolving door in politics and in the civil service. That if, for example, you've been working as a health minister, you don't immediately walk into a job at a private healthcare firm. They do tend to do this, and the reason for that is the rules that ACOBA follow are not statutory. They're not part of the law. And they have cleared David Cameron, who allowed relaxation of visa requirements for Chinese nationals who had lots of contact with President Xi and had a big thing about the relationship with China, to walk into a job which is 2 or 3 days a month, probably pay him £1 billion a year, for a private equity fund which is going to be sorting out Chinese-British trade. And the thing is, you either assume that David Cameron is just a figurehead and didn't really do anything very much as Prime Minister and is just there to the look of the thing, or that he knows exactly what's going on and is there and is useful to that private equity fund, in which case he's exploiting the job that he had and was doing for us. And he's doing it only 18 months after leaving office.
I mean, Nina, should David Cameron just be forced to sit in Cornwall staring out at the seas, demanding the tides turn, you know, or should we not get him out there doing something good and generate a bit of wealth for the economy?
Well, he's not as bad as Tony Blair yet, but of course, I mean, I don't think we can just condemn him to live alone in Cornwall. This is
Tony Blair was at least working in the Middle East as opposed to lining his own pockets, but you know,
as a goodwill ambassador too.
John, take us to page 4 of the Express, and a popular man in certain quarters at the moment, Jacob Rees-Mogg, his star is very high. What's this about?
Yeah, I mean, on one of the other newspapers, of course, the one we saw first, he was described in another article as a sex god. I wouldn't quite go so far as that.
I'm glad. This is a Sunday morning programme.
But he's a very nice guy.
Yeah.
And I think this article is very important because what he's really pointing out is that if we adopt a transition arrangement, which could, of course, go on forever, potentially, in which we are tied to all the European rules, we will effectively not have left. It will be a fraud on the electorate. It will be the biggest fraud on the electorate in living memory, because we'll have Brexit in name only. in order to actually benefit from Brexit, we've got to be able, as we said before, to have the freedoms to do the things that we want to do.
But isn't this partly to do with the fact that Rees-Mogg is in no way afraid of us, crashing out, as some people describe it, of a cliff-edge Brexit? And the reason for that is not because he thinks it's best for the UK economy, it's because he's ideologically committed to it.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, that construction of what you just said, crash out, you know, cliff edge, all those terms that the metropolitan elite use for these issues.
I have to say, it's putting me in the class of metropolitan elite stretching it a little bit.
Are actually, of course, the wrong way of looking at it, because most of our trade with the world at the moment takes place under WTO rules. Actually, it's global trade, and it's very easy to do. And a lot of British firms export. In fact, 57% of our exports operate under those rules. And most of the stuff that the EU buys from the world also operates under those rules. So it's nothing to be afraid of. It's something to be embraced.
Nina?
Well, I disagree. I saw the eyes roll. That's right. There's no major economy that only trades on the basis of WTO rules, and there's no such thing as simply falling back onto WTO rules. And I think timestamp this. So what's going to happen is there will be a transition period unless domestic politics get so messy that we crash out with no kind of deal. And what that will mean, as far as the EU is concerned, is an extension of the status quo. But on the European side as well, it'll have to be time capped. But that means the UK remains a rule taker for the next 2 years after leaving without any say. And that is where we're going to end up, essentially.
Well, Theresa May is convening her war cabinet tomorrow, her full cabinet on Tuesday. I'm sure by Wednesday we'll know exactly what we're going to be doing. Guys, thank you very much. Nina, Susie, John, thanks for being with us this morning. Metropolitan underclass, that's what we are.
Now, as I said at the top of the show, it has been quite a year. This is the moment we look back over the highlights and the low moments, both. But here and now we can do it entirely through the prism of Sunday mornings, music and all. Politics remains turbulent. Theresa May seems almost unchallenged. That story about the misfiring nuclear missile, did you know that misfire had occurred?
Well, I have absolute faith in our Trident missiles.
Prime Minister, did you know?
There are tests that take place all the time.
I'm not going to get an answer to this.
Just pack our bags and run as fast as we can.
Brexit tensions are bubbling.
I'm talking about the highs.
We want to negotiate a good deal with the European Union.
She appears to be heading us in the direction of a sort of bargain basement economy on the shores of Europe.
I'm not going to sit back while Scotland is driven off a hard Brexit cliff edge.
And I heard that sound when the walls came down. I was thinking about you.
Kenneth Branagh has said he cast you because he wanted somebody who could be silent.
He cast me because he wanted someone to be silent?
Yes.
It's like he'd never met me at all.
Do you think hell is real? Is hell there?
Oh, that's a very major question for a
Sunday morning question.
Yes, it's a very Sunday morning question.
I reached out for your hand.
Thanks, Andrew. Thank you, man.
When the walls are caving in.
Oh, it's lovely talking to you too, Andrew. All the best.
Thanks.
You're joking. Not another one?
There's a reason for talking about strong and stable leadership and having a strong and stable government.
It's just that people can listen to that kind of thing and think it's a bit robotic.
No,
do you think killing the leader of ISIS would be helpful for a political solution?
I think the leader of ISIS not being around would be helpful. I'm no supporter or defender in any way whatsoever of ISIS.
We all know it's the truth, that the Prime Minister is heading for a colossal coronation.
I predict that after this election, UKIP could be bigger than it's ever been before.
Yes, if you say so.
Millions of people want answers. Time this morning to probe a little further. How much does that cost? How much money do you intend to borrow over the next 10 years? Do you regret what you said about the IRA?
It was 34 years ago. I had a rather splendid afro at the time. I don't have the same hairstyle. And I don't have the same views.
The standard says that you should be seen within 4 hours.
When was the last time the NHS in England hit that target?
Well, we haven't hit it for over 2 years. It's not acceptable.
Are you a Marxist?
No.
I believe there's a lot to learn.
No or a yes? I couldn't work it out.
Well, I tell you, I believe there's a lot to learn from reading Capital.
People hate this policy, and it makes them very, very nervous indeed. Is there any chance at all you're going to look at it again?
No.
Tonight at 10, Theresa May is forced to backtrack on one of her key manifesto pledges.
Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
These are very angry times. Is there anything on which we can agree?
No, but it's 25 billion is covered.
Plus
no, don't
40
make this
billion
up.
for the
Do
national
not make
grid.
this up.
You've just said, for example, that I want to negotiate the future of the Falkland Studies. I did
That
not.
Is what? Just say it again, come on.
It is untrue.
I want to declare that I'm a feminist. I absolutely believe in... I do. I believe completely in women's rights.
This is your moment on live television to say that I will stick by my principles. I, Nigel Farage, would not accept this pension.
Of course I would take it. I've said that right from day one. Well, of course.
This is the sort of hypocrisy that we see.
No. I said it from day one. It is not hypocrisy. I've just voted to get rid of my job. I was the turkey that voted for Christmas.
Sometimes I feel like throwing my hands up in the air. I know I can count on you.
We spend so much time talking about the things that we disagree with each other on, and we're very bad at actually just pausing for a second and focusing on those things, those fundamental things that bind us together.
Oh, the going gets so hard, but I know you got the love. You got the love. Said you got the love.
The Conservatives are the largest party. Note, they don't have an overall majority.
We laughed and we roared, we staggered and fell.
Theresa May is a dead woman walking. It's just how long she's going to remain on death row. I don't agree with her. She won, the biggest share of the vote since, I think, the 1987 election.
You lost the election. You accept that?
We didn't win the election.
OK. You didn't win it. The Prime Minister was planning to sack you, apparently.
Yeah, it's true that my role in the election campaign was not the one I would have liked it to be.
Boris Johnson has lobbed a verbal firework into the Brexit debate. Oh, Boris.
I don't want him managing the Brexit process.
This is backseat driving, in effect.
Yeah, you could call it backseat driving.
I just don't understand why she hasn't fired it.
Is he unsackable?
Look, let's be very clear.
What happens if we don't get a deal?
No deal would be a very, very bad outcome for Britain.
It would be less good than a good deal.
You can be sure there'll be a deal.
To some, he is the arch defender of the Jewish people. To others, he's a bellicose hardliner dedicated to expanding the very settlement seen by the Palestinian Arabs as their obstacle to peace. And he joins me now. Welcome, Prime Minister.
The good part was shorter than the bad part.
Thank you for having me, Andrew. I'm delighted to be in one of my favorite TV programs.
I was shocked and very disappointed, obviously. Yes, I did think I was going to win, so did nearly everybody else.
Do you have any numbers about how much that's going to cost?
Well, Andrew, it's a big abacus that I'm working on.
You'll always get more than you have to pay out.
Just wanting a number. No. Just one little number.
Well,
just one tiny
you're
little
You're
number.
asking the wrong question.
Where are all these unemployed people? There are no unemployed people.
There's 1.4 million unemployed people in this country. Is it OK to watch porn at work?
Well...
Can I ask you whether this agreement this week is actually real?
No, it is conditional on an outcome. No, I'm afraid that wasn't quite right. This was a statement of intent more than anything else. It was much more a statement of intent than it was a legally enforceable thing.
At my face for the last time. I never knew you, you never knew me. Say hello, goodbye.
Then we moved over to fruitcakes, and of course the great moment came
in 2001 when the Queen gave us the most imperial chocolate, fruitcake she gave us.
Are you going to put a collar back on again now, Archbishop?
Andrew, I promise that when Mugabe goes, I'll put my collar on. So I have no choice but to put it back on.
Say hello, wave goodbye.
And hello again. Watching that were Tim Shipman, Emma Barnett and Rachel Johnson, who've rejoined us. Emma, you got the first interview with the Prime Minister. We haven't talked a lot about Theresa May on this show, immediately after that election result, and she was very emotional. Were you convinced?
Yes, I mean, we talked about what did she do when that exit poll came in, and unlike us who were covering it going, what do we do now? Or Mayday, as Rachel was telling me, some people were texting her during that, but she definitely wanted to say she was devastated, and then I asked her, devastated enough, you know, to sort of shed a tear. I can't tell if she wanted to share that information, but she did say she then did cry, and she had a moment with her husband Philip. And I was very interested to learn the human reaction of someone when they've taken the biggest political gamble of their life.
Absolutely. Speaking of political gambles, what about Boris's year and looking ahead to 2018?
Oh. Are you looking at me or Shippers?
I was looking at you. I got a very Johnsonian stare back.
Paddington's hard stare. It's forthcoming when you ask me about Boris on the Marr show, Andrew. I think he's, you know, as you will read in today's Sunday Times, he's brimming with this indelible positivity about the future. You know, he's a ho for the open seas man. And, you know, this is where he wants to take the cabinet, and we'll see how that goes next week.
Tim, you've written 2 volumes now about these extraordinary times we're living in. Is there going to be a third one about 2018, do you think?
I hope not. I've promised my wife I won't be writing a third book in 2018. But watching all that gives you sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. And it's, given what's unfolded over the last 2 years, it would be pretty rash to predict that it would be dull in 2018.
It's not going to be dull. Emma, what are you looking forward to for 2018? Not personally, but in terms of politics.
Theresa May clinging on, Jeremy Corbyn clinging on. I mean, there's no other alternative for Theresa May. It's unwise to make predictions in the sense of we can never seemingly predict what is going to happen. But what I would say is we have to all work very, very hard, because I do think people, however you voted in that referendum, didn't vote to be bored. And so to keep Brexit interesting...
It's jolly hard work, isn't it? Jolly hard work.
To keep it interesting,
we do our best.
Boris is doing his best to keep it interesting.
Very briefly, Rachel, you joined the Lib Dems famously. We haven't talked a lot about them. Are you still committed to that cause, or do you think you joined a sinking ship?
The Lib Dems didn't have a stellar year. I think that to move the question on, I mean, one of my predictions for next year is that, sadly, I don't think we are going to see the emergence of a centre-left party or even centre-right party to occupy this enormous space in the middle ground between the two extremes that we are now seeing driving politics.
And that sage thought is the last political commentary from the Marr show this year. Thank you all very, very much indeed.
Now, as we all know, making political predictions is child's play. Dead easy. In fact, virtually everything everyone predicted this time last year for 2017 has come to pass exactly as predicted. So instead, let's take a look back at the year gone by and have a little peek into the crystal ball at the year ahead with a distinguished panel of MPs. Labour's Rupa Huck, Joanna Cherry for the SNP, and the Conservative MP Oliver Dowden. Very good morning to all of you. This was, of course, an election year, so that seems like an appropriate place to begin. Oliver, was the general election a mistake?
Well, yes, of course it was with hindsight, but most of the people that were supporting it before it happened, you know, they supported it at the time. So it's all very well for us to say it's a mistake now. You can't criticise the Prime Minister for calling it when people at the time supported it themselves.
But the one thing I think we can all agree on is that Theresa May's longevity, you know, when we looked at it in the immediate aftermath of the general election as compared to now, I mean, she's clung on.
Yeah, I mean, it's been a bit of a roller coaster. There's been so many ups and downs. That started with them with a 20-point lead, and it was a totally unnecessary election. She had purely to get more power. You know, all those Daily Mail headlines, crush the saboteurs. I mean, I was meant to be a goner myself. I had a very small, I think I was the most vulnerable in London, second most vulnerable in the whole country. I came back from a majority that was 200 odd to nearly 14,000. So, I mean, it was a massive miscalculation. And, you know, to call an election for a stronger hand for Brexit and then to lose your majority, just unbelievable. I mean, we have 37 new colleagues now, 37 net gains, 37 gains that we made. So, I mean, but then she has got this longevity, as you say, because everyone thought she would be a goner by Christmas, and she's clinging on.
Now, in terms of the winners and losers from the general election, I never like to call anyone within punching distance, you know, a loser, because, you know, it can come back the other way. But, you know, arguably, Joanna, I mean, each one of you here, in a different way, lost the election, didn't you?
Well, you can't say the SNP lost the election in Scotland because we've got 35.
Alex Salmond, Angus Robertson.
Tasmania.
Well, we've got 35 out of the 59 seats in Scotland, more than all the other parties put together. And now we're really in the position that everyone expected us to be in 2015 when we had that really quite amazing landslide, took more than 50% of the vote.
Just a gentle rebalancing of things then.
Of course, it's been difficult for us to lose people of the calibre of Alec and also our Westminster leader. But really, the real issue here is that for Theresa May, this was a gamble that hasn't paid off. And now she finds herself at the ransom of 11 DUP MPs, 11 MPs from the most right-wing and marginal party in the United Kingdom. And we've already seen that that's cost her over £1 billion, and it's also cost her. She's lost huge face in Brussels because she was on the verge a couple of Fridays ago of reaching a deal. One phone call to Arlene Foster and the rug was pulled from under Theresa May's feet. So I think the real issue here is that the SNP are still the largest party in Scotland by a country mile. And interestingly, maybe viewers in England don't realise this, the Tories have now in Scotland dropped back to third place in the polls. Labour are back at second place, and Ruth Davidson's taking fright so much about her chances of being First Minister in Scotland that she's looking to bail and get a Westminster seat.
I mean, Olive, to be fair, I mean, if the DUP did wheech the rug out from under the feet of Theresa May, you know, in a few days after, they kind of pretty quickly shoved it back under. I mean, we have now moved on to phase 2. That is an achievement, isn't it?
Yes, I think it's a significant achievement. And actually, Rupert was talking about the Prime Minister clinging on. You're talking about a weak government. Really, that's not proved to be the case. The Prime Minister has accepted that she made a mistake over calling the general election, but since then she's set about actually sorting things out. And I think this autumn she's passed 3 huge tests. First of all, she's demonstrated she can deliver a budget. Many people said she couldn't manage to deliver a successful budget. Secondly, despite the one defeat last week, actually the withdrawal bill is progressing well. We're on track for Brexit. And thirdly, despite all the Cassandras, all these predictions that it would be a disaster, we'd not open up phase 2. She's shown determination, resilience. She's succeeded with phase 1. We're on to phase 2, and Brexit is proceeding as expected.
The other prediction, though, that was made around about May 2017 was that the Labour Party were to be entirely wiped out in the general election. I mean, you have to admit, Jeremy Corbyn has exceeded expectations, hasn't he?
Well, there were very low expectations for Jeremy Corbyn in the first place. Clearly, Jeremy Corbyn won seats, but it is worth reminding people that still the Conservative Party won the election in terms of having the largest number of seats and being able to form a government. I actually think one of the things that happened during that election, and one of my reflections, is we really didn't take the economic argument strongly enough to Jeremy Corbyn, and we allowed Jeremy Corbyn and the Labour Party to get away with this idea that you could spend huge amounts of money, whether it's on scrapping tuition fees and scrapping all the debt, clearly not deliverable, whether it's nationalising industries. And I think that's something we need to take on to Labour more.
I mean, we did have a costed manifesto, as did the Lib Dems, but the Conservative one, there weren't any figures in it at all. And to see a leader of the opposition at Glastonbury having people chant his name, that's pretty unprecedented. So I think, yeah, they massively underestimated.
He also said to Michael Leavis he'd be in Downing Street by Christmas. So, you know, it's a year of peaks and troughs for Jeremy Corbyn.
Also, he's still not, despite the fact that Theresa May is completely on the ropes, Jeremy Corbyn is still not ahead in the opinion polls. And I would disagree with Oliver that Theresa May has delivered a successful budget. One of the curiosities about Brexit is it's such a disaster that it's keeping us from focusing on the economic disaster underlying Brexit, whereby this government haven't met any of their targets. Growth is at a record low. Wages are squeezed. These are not my views. These are the views of the Office of Budget Responsibility,
well,
the
I'm
IFS,
not sure how you
and
can
the Resolution
describe
Foundation.
Record employment, record low unemployment as an economic disaster. I think actually the economy has proved remarkably strong through the Brexit period.
I'm talking about low growth, low productivity and squeezed wages.
At the same time, I mean, the goalposts have slightly shifted on the opposition benches. You didn't think that we were going to get to phase 2?
Oh, I don't think anyone necessarily thought we wouldn't get to phase 2, but the real question is, as some of your panellists were discussing earlier, is what's going to happen at the end of phase 2. This wholly unrealistic attitude that a trade deal can be delivered within the space of a few months, when we saw that the CETA deal took years to deliver, and also this complete lack of focus on the very important issue of services, which are so important for the United Kingdom economy. I mean, they're really living in cloud cuckoo land.
I just want to broaden things a little bit. And one of the interesting aspects, one of the most interesting aspects of this year is the way in which the kind of the domestic political agenda has really been turned on its head. I mean, the age of austerity, it would appear, certainly there is not the clamour for us to get down the deficit, get rid of the debt in the way that we did before. You look at incidents such as, Grenfell Tower and the broader arguments about social and affordable housing. Is that where the Labour Party thinks it can make most gains in 2017, on the big domestic policy points?
I mean, again, I think that Brexit played a part in that last general election. We won seats we've never had before. Kensington, never before. Canterbury. And so I think it's a sort of mixture
Sheffield Hallam from Nick Clegg.
Yeah, indeed.
Well, there are some issues around that seat at the
question
moment.
mark over. Yeah, no, but I think it was a combination of different factors. But Grenfell is an appalling sign of what happens when you don't take poor people seriously. I mean, that was a completely avoidable...
You don't have adequate social housing.
Yeah.
I mean, the Scottish Government have shown that you can go in a different direction in this. The Scottish Government has built over 30,000 affordable homes. They're pledged to build another 50,000 affordable homes. We've built many council houses, unlike the last Labour government in Scotland, who only built 6 council houses. And we've now, just last week, introduced security of tenure for people...
And finally you've used those income tax powers that you were given quite some time ago.
So 7 out of 10 Scots will now be better off as a result of our income tax reforms in Scotland.
Why did it take so long?
Well, I mean, these powers took a while to bed in. The Scottish Government has been very busy fighting a series of elections, which they didn't want, and also an EU referendum, which Scots didn't want. So we've had our hands full.
40% of them did. That's not an insignificant number.
We have also been introducing a new social security system in Scotland, which is a massive job with the 15% of social security powers that have been devolved to us. But what matters now is that Derek Mackay has introduced a budget which shows a different direction for the rest of the UK. 7 out of 10 Scots will be paying less income tax. People earning less than 30%, people earning less than 30,000 a year in the public sector are going to get a 3% rise. Those earning above 30,000 are going to get a 2% rise. These are steps that could be taken by the Conservatives if they really wanted to, if they weren't so focused on running down the British economy as a result of Brexit.
As a Conservative, I'm not in favour of putting up taxes for people earning over £33,000 a year.
That
would hit
less?
Nurses, it would hit doctors,
I'm going to pay £3 more a week.
Teachers in my constituency.
Could you afford to pay £3 more a week, Oliver?
There are lots of teachers in my constituency, lots of doctors who would not appreciate having to pay, if they're earning more than £33,000, more tax, and it's a difference between this.
Do you know what, guys? I won't want to end this on a positive note. I want Christmas cheer to be the theme of the day. So I want my triumvirate of Mystic Moggs to now start providing me with some yes/no answers to some very straight questions. Okay. First question to all three of you: will there be an election next year?
I think they'll cling on as long as
yes, no,
that's a no.
No.
Definitely not, Prime Minister.
We're going to stick to this yes/no thing, guys. Will your party leader still be in post this time next year?
Yes.
100% yes.
You're on. That's a yellow card for you, Mr. Dowden. Should Donald Trump visit the UK in 2018? No?
No way. He's not conducive to good race relations here.
Excellent. Will there be a second referendum?
Not anytime soon.
On the EU, Joanna?
Not in 2018.
Definitely not.
And a final question to you all. Will we be more prosperous outside the European Union?
No way. We can see it already.
Absolutely not.
We have a great opportunity to seize it, and we can do much better outside.
Right, well, I look forward to receiving your Christmas cards, chaps. I'm sure they've just been delayed in the post. But for now, thanks very much for coming in, and all the best to you and yours in the festive season.
Thank you.
And to you.
Now, you will often hear people on TV shows like this one in December reflecting on what a momentous year it's been in politics. Well, this time, we really mean it. Again. We sent Ellie Price off for a gentle stroll through the events that have shaped 2017.
2017 was shaped by what happened when Theresa May went for a hike with her husband in April and came back with a jolly good idea.
I have just chaired a meeting of the Cabinet where we agreed that the government should call a general election to be held on the 8th of June.
General election. You're joking. Not another one?
The path to victory seemed so clear. Article 50 had been triggered, the Tories had won a by-election, and then made big gains across the country at the local elections, at the expense of UKIP, whose vote collapsed, and Labour.
Yes, we have to go out there in the next 4 weeks and get a message out.
Labour launched a manifesto that called for the renationalisation of the water companies and an end to tuition fees.
This is a programme of hope. The Tory campaign, by contrast, is built on one word: fear.
The Tories, meanwhile, unveiled a document that included scrapping free school lunches for children in England and a shake-up of the social care system.
Let us all go forward together.
But then the way forward wasn't so obvious, and Theresa May was forced into a U-turn on social care.
Nothing has changed. Nothing has changed.
Then she refused to take part in any head-to-head televised debates.
The Prime Minister is not here tonight. She can't be bothered, so why should you? In fact, Bake Off is on BBC Two next.
It wasn't Bake Off, but she did go on the TV and talk about the bins, and it all seemed a bit cringy.
I get to decide when I take the bins out, not if I take the bins out.
But, I mean, of
There's
course...
boy jobs and girl jobs, you see.
There's boy jobs and girl jobs.
What boy and girl?
And then there was that weird time that the Prime Minister was asked what was the naughtiest thing she'd ever done as a child. She said it was to run through a field of wheat. Come on, Ed. Come on, Ed. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn was positively frolicking out on the campaign trail, greeted like a rock star at his well-attended rallies. The other party leaders also had their challenges.
You won't say whether you think having gay sex is a sin.
Winning those 56 seats will be a huge challenge for Nicola Sturgeon's party. Ruth Davidson has predicted that we've hit peak Nat, that the only way is down. This party... Hello.
And what we're saying is the Conservatives are the largest party. Note, they don't have an overall majority at this stage.
Deal or no deal, Mrs Foster?
The Conservatives lost 12 seats, creating a hung parliament. So, 18 days after the election, Theresa May did a deal with the Democratic Unionist Party's 10 MPs from Northern Ireland. Meanwhile, Jeremy Corbyn was hanging out with his new mates at Glastonbury. With the election over, Brexit negotiations dominated the summer, and keeping control of her own party was an uphill struggle for the PM. That's why everyone was focused on her conference speech, including a prankster.
Boris, job done there.
An errant frog.
The deficit is back to pre-crisis levels.
And then the scenery fell down. The PM put on a brave face and was supported by her husband, and later her cabinet, after some whisperings about her leadership. By the end of October, the sexual harassment scandal hit Westminster. Various MPs were implicated, and so was a cabinet minister, who stood down.
Below the high standards.
A week later, another cabinet resignation. This time, Priti Patel, the International Development Secretary, fell on her sword over unauthorised meetings she'd had with Israeli officials while on holiday. Although there are plenty of 2017 moments Theresa May would probably rather forget, this handshake, just last week, was a crucial breakthrough in the Brexit negotiations. The moment the EU accepted it was time to move on and talk about the future relationship. Of course, that doesn't mean negotiations next year will be any easier. But with everything going on this year, 2018 couldn't possibly be so frantic, could it?
So there's plenty to talk about in terms of what were the big moments of last year and what's likely to come in the year ahead with our panel. So I'll ask you first, Steve, what was your favourite moment of the year politically?
I can cheat, as you kindly asked me first. It must be that exit poll. We just saw it again there. At the moment that was announced, you felt British politics changing in dramatic ways, as it has done. In my view, it's been the most significant political year in terms of change since 1979, even though the same Prime Minister is in place. In that second, you realised that it was a myth that a figure to the left of Tony Blair would doom Labour to electoral oblivion. You realised that young people were starting to vote with profound policy implications, which we're already starting to see. and that will continue. And you recognised in that nanosecond that she had lost her mandate for Brexit, and a hung parliament would transform the politics of Brexit, as we were discussing earlier. It meant many other things as well, I think, that exit poll. Be a Brexit poll another time.
We've been saying Brexit all year.
It was just a huge moment that I think some of us will never, ever forget.
What was your moment of the year, Camilla?
I can't believe we've crammed all that into a year. It feels like a lot longer. I think that seminal week, actually, where Boris wrote his 4,000-word thesis on Brexit, which anyone who is a Brexiteer reading it had Land of Hope and Glory ringing in their ears, and then how that may or may not have changed Theresa May's Florence speech. Downing Street very much rode against the idea that any of the substance was changed, but I think there's an acceptance that his very Union Jack flying tone was incorporated into that speech, which then became the set piece of how she set out Britain's future going forward. And I thought that was quite a seminal week.
Dom?
Well, I was tempted to say the incredible walk down the White House Conde that Theresa May did with Donald Trump way back in January, where they held hands. I mean, what an extraordinary picture that was. And, you know, for those of us out there to see what she'd actually just gone and done, and what a difference a year makes, she can't even get him to return her calls anymore after the Twitter spat. But I'm going to be cheeky and actually go for another one, which was the conference speech, the Theresa May's conference speech, which you just saw there. And again, for anyone who's in that room, it was the most excruciating 55 minutes of anyone's political careers or journalistic careers. But it's also really a very powerful metaphor for her premiership. Things are falling apart at the seams. It is not going at all how she planned, yet she is still there.
And if we learned anything this year, it's that we shouldn't make political predictions because we're almost certainly going to be proved wrong. But I'm nonetheless going to ask you for a couple of predictions for the year ahead. Will we have a trade deal by October, Tom?
No, we won't. Not least because the EU have said they're not going to offer on a trade deal at any stage. They're going to offer us a political declaration. Those are the words in the Council document on Friday. We might get that, although I think that's also unlikely by October.
Will Theresa May still be Prime Minister, Camilla?
By Christmas?
Well, this time next year.
Next Christmas, not this one.
No, I know, not this Christmas. I think she's safe for this Christmas. I think it's very dependent on what happens in October. I think she might still be Prime Minister. In fact, she probably will be. But will she have set out at that point a timetable for a change in leadership? Possibly.
And will the Cabinet look the same, Steve, do you think?
Not entirely, but I think all the key players will still be in place, actually. I think it will be too disruptive to change them, but that is a sort of tentative prediction. But what an extraordinary figure Theresa May is. She's nowhere near as actorly as most of our prime ministers. And yet it's as if she's taking part in a sort of James Bond thriller half the time. It's a very curious contrast, this shy, dogged figure. And the theatrics will continue well into next year, and yet I think she will still be there at the end of it.
She is fascinating, isn't she? Because in some ways in this year we've seen some of her weaknesses. They tried to build an election campaign around a presidential-style leadership, and she was really ill-suited to that. And now, as we were saying earlier, she's using weakness as a strength when it comes to negotiating in Europe. She hasn't really shown us her cards on Brexit. But that's probably to her advantage as well, Tom.
Exactly. This Sphinx-like character, no one really knows what actually makes her tick, what's really going on inside her head. It could be nothing. Maybe it's just entirely empty. Therefore, she's allowed to be this beautifully pragmatic character who can sort of plough her way through the waves. But coming to a point earlier, I think it's absolutely right. Inside the bubble, you know, we kick her for this, we kick her for that. She loses votes, she does a terrible speech. But I think outside in the country, I'm really struck, actually, the more and more people you talk to who say, do you know what, good on her. She's getting all the stuff thrown at her, she's getting her side kicking her, she's getting the EU kicking her, but she still carries on, she's still there. And her indefatigability, which I can never actually say, but
too exhausting to say.
In itself is remarkable, which is why she's still proving, you know, the Prime Minister of our times.
And Corbyn will still be there?
Corbyn will be there. Does Corbyn want to be there? I think Corbyn will be there by next year. What will happen in the future, goodness only knows. And I think as well, looking back at the rally, it's interesting how popular and how idolised he was then in that campaigning mode, which of course he was far better suited to than Theresa May, who wasn't surrounded by crowds and just seemed to be standing on a podium somewhere with a few people with Tory banners behind her. I don't know. I think the shine is coming off Corbyn, and I think the more that Labour tie themselves in knots over Brexit, I mean, having Richard Bunyan on earlier saying about let's have the EU, ECJ ruling us forever and let's not cut immigration, is not going to play well with Labour Brexit voters.
All right, well, we'll be back to discuss all of this next year, but for now, Steve, Camilla, Tom, thank you very much.